Okay, so we are live. We can begin.
Hello, friends. Uh, I can't see the video. Hello.
Yeah, hello, sir. You will be able to, sir. Just start the webinar, sir.
Yeah. Hello, friends. It's indeed a pleasure, and I mean it, to be able to reconnect with humanity after 17 days of isolation. It's a real pleasure to be back in touch. And who better than our own fraternity of IVF specialists and friends? And for this, I'd really like to thank ISAR, especially Dr. Prakash Trivedi, Dr. Jaideep Malhotra, Dr. Kedar Gandla, and all the other office bearers who must have worked tirelessly to put us together on such an excellent academic platform for all the infertility specialists all over India. We are in the midst of a huge pandemic of the coronavirus, an unprecedented threat of unimaginable proportions to our various existence. But of course, we all pray and hope that it will go away. But we also must remember that in the midst of this pandemic, we have a small epidemic brewing in our very own field of IVF, and that is the epidemic of the poor responder. I'm sure all of you would agree that in a day to day practice, there are a huge proportion of patients who do not respond the way we would like them to. Of course, we have the expected poor responders in the form of the elderly patients, young patients with a diminished ovarian reserve with low AMH and low AFC. But we also have a huge proportion of patients with normal ovarian reserve who sometimes, despite aggressive ovarian stimulation, just do not give us the kind of response and the kind of oocytes that we would like to have. We also have a lot of patients who are hyporesponders. The follicles remain stagnant in the range of 10 to 12 mm for 5 days, 7 days. Despite our stepping up of doses, they just don't grow. These are patients who have polymorphisms of the FSH and LH receptors. We also have patients where we have an asynchronous cohort. Normally we like to have all follicles to be in synchrony, but many a times we find that one follicle shoots ahead and the others are left behind, lagging behind. Sometimes we have a decent number of follicles, but we don't get the right proportion of oocytes that we expected. A lot of the follicles turn out to be empty. Sometimes we have a lot of oocytes, but not all of them are metaphase 2. And sometimes we have metaphase 2 oocytes, and all do not give us top quality embryos. So, to my mind, definitions apart, there is a huge spectrum of response which just doesn't fit the bill and is not ideal in an IVF scenario. Of course, we have Sankara's classical study, which clearly showed us that if you have 5 to 15 oocytes, which is the ideal targeted number that you must have, you would have optimal fresh embryo transfer pregnancy rates. But today, in the world of vitrification and where we are talking of cumulative live birth rates from a single oocyte retrieval, we know that the ideal number of oocytes you would want is, say, 20 to 25. So why is it important to put the poor responder into perspective? And you can see here clearly when a patient gives you 3 or less oocytes, your live birth rates are very low in the range of just 10 to 15%. And this is the importance of why today we are discussing this category of patients, and that is the poor responder. Why is there so much confusion? If you look back at literature, you have 47 RCTs, you have 41 different definitions of what constitutes the poor responders. Some take into account just age and AMH and AFC, some take into account the number of oocytes that you got with ovarian stimulation, and so on and so forth. But there are no more than 3 trials in any category using the same definition. And this is where all the confusion arises. Also, if you look at interventions, if you do a thorough literature search on PubMed, you will see 32 different recommended interventions for poor responders. So, how does one actually pick up the right approach to treating these patients? It's very easy if you remember 3 simple physiological principles. Whenever you have a potential poor responder, remember these 3 points. One, that there is a patient who has a reduced number of FSH sensitive follicles. So, this is the patient who has a diminished ovarian reserve. She has a low AMH, a low AFC, and she just doesn't have the number of follicles required to give you a good response. The second group is where your dose was inadequate. So she had a good number of FSH sensitive follicles, but somewhere you made an error in the amount of FSH or HMG which was administered. So you had a suboptimal exposure of this patient to gonadotropins, and therefore you resulted in a poor ovarian response. And the third is you have good follicles, you have adequate amount of ovarian reserve. You also gave her the optimal dose of FSH and HMG, and yet she did not respond as you wanted her to because she is the patient who is carrying some polymorphism of the FSH or LH receptors. So if you understand these 3 categories, then it becomes very easy to manage and treat these patients. So originally, of course, we had the classical Bolono criteria in 2011, which said that a poor responder is any patient who any previous cycle gave you less than or equal to 3 oocytes despite maximal ovarian stimulation. You had the second category of patients with the age of more than 40 or any other acquired risk factor for reduced ovarian reserve. And you had a third category of patients who had abnormal ovarian reserve tests. So they had a low AMH or a low AFC. So if any two out of these three factors were present, we would consider the patient and define her as a poor responder. But this definition did not take into account two or three aspects. And the main two aspects was that you cannot compare a patient who is 25-year-old and gives you 3 oocytes with a 40-year-old who gives you 3 oocytes, because the percentage of euploid embryos of blastocysts will differ in these two patients, right? So if you have, say, a young patient, you would have a 66% incidence of euploid embryos, whereas if you have an elderly patient, you might have just a 10% incidence of euploid embryos. So just taking number of eggs as a criteria for definition may not be enough. So therefore, we were introduced to the Poseidon definition of low responders, which now introduces two new categories of the impaired response. You have first a suboptimal responder. That means a patient where you retrieve just 4 to 9 oocytes, which at any given age is associated with a significantly lower live birth rate as compared to a normal responder, that is a patient who gives you the normal 10 to 15 oocytes. And you also have the hypo responders, where the patient's follicles just do not grow. You need a much higher dose of gonadotropin. Very prolonged stimulation in the follicular phase is then required to obtain the adequate number of oocytes. And these are, of course, the patients who carry polymorphisms. They often have the less active LH variant. They might need higher doses of FSH or also LH supplementation for you to rescue that cycle. So finally, the Poseidon criteria then combine both qualitative and quantitative parameters, namely the age of the patient and the expected aneuploidy rate, as I told you earlier. And you have to also consider biomarkers and functional markers like AMH, AFC, and polymorphisms. So that gave us the 4 Poseidon groups. You have Poseidon group 1, group 2, group 3, and group 4. To keep it simple, group 1 and 2 are patients who may be young or old. They have an adequate ovarian reserve. So the antral follicle count is more than 5, your AMH levels are normal, and these still do not respond optimally. So you have group 1 and 2, young and old patients with a normal ovarian response. Subgroups 1A, if you get less than 4 oocytes, subgroup 1B, if you get 4 to 9 oocytes, both categories giving you less than the ideal 10 to 15 oocytes which you should be getting. And then you have group 3 or 4, which are the expected poor responders. These are young and old patients who begin with a diminished ovarian reserve. So they have a lower AMH and a low AFC, and you know that these are expected to give you a poor ovarian response. 50% of patients in any IVF clinic, especially in the urban centers, would fall into one of these 4 groups. So this is why I said that this is kind of an epidemic, because a huge proportion of patients are falling into one of these 4 categories. There are too many treatment suggestions, whether you should use the agonist protocol, whether that over suppresses, whether the antagonist protocol is better when you're dealing with a poor responder. Should you use FSH or should you use HMG? What is the maximal dose of gonadotropin that you should be using? What about the role of natural cycle or mild stimulation IVF? Is there anything to be gained from the latest and the novel dual stimulation protocols? Should you be doing ICSI for all these patients, or is IVF equally good? And what is the place for adjuvant therapies such as androgens and growth hormone? So let us go through them one by one. Now, when you look at group 1 and 2, and again I repeat, these are young and old patients with a normal AMH and AFC with an unexplained poor or suboptimal response. The usual reasons for this happening in these two categories is either there is undertreatment because you gave her a lower dose of gonadotropin, or these are carriers of the polymorphisms, or what I find very, very common in practice is asynchronous development. A lot of us neglect this aspect. We feel, oh, okay, one follicle has gone ahead. How does it matter? We'll still get our 5 or 6 oocytes and everything will go well. But remember here that getting a synchronous cohort is very important when you're dealing with a potential poor responder. So pre-treatment is extremely important here. We also need to consider how high can you go with the FSH or HMG doses. Will LH supplementation help these patients? And is the agonist protocol better than the antagonist protocol for this group of patients? So let us begin with the first, and that is the luteal phase estrogen. First method of programming or scheduling patients. Oral contraceptive pills, of course, that's a total presentation in itself, are not recommended because you are over suppressing an already suppressed patient, and the outcomes are not too good in terms of follicular phase of stimulation, the number of days of stimulation, the number of ampules consumed, and the pregnancy rates. Also, there is a very good study now to show that the higher the suppression of LH at the beginning of your stimulation, which is very likely to be there when you have used prolonged OC pill suppression, the higher is your percentage of suboptimal response. And just to diverse a little, a lot of us, we know that most of our egg donors are usually put on oral contraceptive pills. Most of them are high responders. And very often, or most of the time, we need to give them the agonist trigger. Now, the agonist trigger only works if there is endogenous LH and FSH, which is still there to be released. If this patient has taken a lot of OC pill suppression, as is usually the norm with most agencies, her LH will be over suppressed. And then when you give the agonist trigger, you just don't get the kind of oocytes or the number of metaphase 2 oocytes that you require. So please remember that not only for poor responders, but also for normal or high responders, it is best to avoid the oral contraceptive pills totally as far as programming or scheduling is concerned. So then you will ask, what are the options? The first and my personal favorite is the use of estradiol valerate. Very easy to use. You give it 2 milligrams twice a day from day 25 if she has a 28-day cycle. She then reports to you during her menstruation. So say she comes in on day 1, which happens to be a Monday. You don't want to start stimulation on the Tuesday because the next weekend you have a conference or a holiday to go for. All you need to do is make her continue the estradiol valerate, and you can push in this way until day 9. So the beauty of the estradiol valerate is that it will not suppress her menstruation, that will come at its scheduled time. But at the same time, you gain the advantage of postponing the onset of stimulation by 8 days. So you can say, for example, continue estradiol valerate until say Thursday or Friday. Her bleeding will stop. You may even have a triple line endometrium. But when you scan her on Friday or Saturday, which is the day you want to begin FSH, she will not have any dominant follicle. And that is what programming is all about. We don't want the phenomenon of follicular dominance. So this is a very simple way where you don't suppress the axis too much. You gain your days of programming or scheduling, and you also ensure that you get your uniform cohort, and you also ensure that you can go without having any feelings of guilt for your conference or holiday, and you have not compromised her outcome in any manner. So this is a beautiful way of synchronizing, but of course, it's not ideal for batch IVF because maximum you can play up to is just 8 or 9 days. Even something simpler, and of course, there's one more paper which has come now, which not only shows the benefit of luteal phase estradiol, but it goes further on to say that you don't need to stop the estradiol when you begin FSH. So normal recommendation was that, okay, if you start FSH on Saturday, estradiol stops on Friday, you then begin FSH from Saturday. This paper shows that you can continue estradiol along with the FSH or HMG stimulation until the day of HCG injection. And in fact, it showed that there was a much higher pregnancy rate when you continued estradiol valerate until the day of HCG. So this just shows how harmless it is and how beautiful it is, a method of programming or scheduling so as to get a good uniform synchronous cohort of follicles without one follicle becoming dominant. The other novel or simple way of doing it is, of course, the Fisher protocol, which we had last year published. You can begin simple norethistérone, 5 milligrams, is given twice a day from day 20 if she has a 28-day cycle. Minimum 7 days, maximum 14 days. You can stop on a Sunday between the 7th and the 14th day. She will expect menstruation on Thursday, and you begin stimulation from Friday. So just as with the OC pill, where you need to ensure a 5-day washout period before you begin FSH or HMG, the same way here, you withdraw the norethistérone. Again, the suppression will not be as strong as with the oral contraceptive pill, and you will get a beautiful outcome with a good synchronous cohort of follicles. A third, very recent and a very unique way of programming to ensure that you get a uniform cohort is the use of the antagonist. And here you can see that you can give the GnRH antagonist. Suppose she comes in on a Monday and you don't want to start stimulation till say Thursday, and Monday is day 2. You give her the antagonist on day 2, 3, and 4, that is Monday through Wednesday. And from Thursday, that is day 5, you can begin your stimulation and consider Friday as day 2 of the cycle and proceed as normal. And you can clearly see, as this paper shows from 2011 from Christoph Blockil, that you will get a higher number of oocytes with the use of the antagonist. So you get a more uniform cohort. And they also showed higher ongoing pregnancy rates per started cycle, although that did not achieve statistical significance. But the point is that you get programming, you are not compromising the outcome in any manner, you are not reducing pregnancy rates in any manner, you are in fact improving the number of oocytes that you retrieve and also the ongoing pregnancy rates per started cycle. Moving on then, that whether agonist is better or antagonist is better for Poseidon groups 1 and 2, you can see here in this worldwide survey in 2010, they showed that most of us had for some reason switched to the antagonist, especially for poor responders. Just 9% of the world's IVF specialists continued to use the agonist for poor responders. Now remember one thing, that the biggest advantage of the long agonist protocol was better synchronization of follicles. Now I keep repeating this because this is a very neglected area and we need to emphasize this so that you can further fine tune your stimulation to get a best cohort of metaphase 2 oocytes for the patient. So we knew that the agonist gave you better synchronization as compared to the antagonist protocol. We also knew that because of the higher number of gonadotropin ampules required and the higher doses required, you got more oocytes. This in turn resulted in hyperstimulation in some normal and high responder patients. But isn't this what you want in the poor responder? How are you going to get hyperstimulation in a poor responder? Isn't more the merrier better in a poor responder patient? And you would say, how much difference would it make? Does it really matter if you get one or two more oocytes? And I'll subsequently show you some slides to show that even if you get one extra oocyte or two extra oocytes, you have a significantly higher live birth rate. So the reason we all switched to the antagonist was to avoid OHSS. But again, remember the point that this is not going to happen in poor responders. Do we have evidence for this? Yes, we have this large study from a year ago, which clearly shows when it compares the antagonist with the agonist, mean number of oocytes retrieved much higher with the agonist, mean number of embryos available statistically significantly higher with the agonist, pregnancy rates also significantly higher at almost 57.95% as compared to just 32% with the antagonist, and live birth rates again significantly higher with the use of the agonist protocol. So we need to now rethink and not have standard protocols for every IVF patient that steps into your clinic, that you just give a standard OC pill, put everybody on 225, put everybody on the antagonist and just do a standardized way. You need to individualize your protocols, and the agonist needs to be seriously reconsidered for use, especially in some normal responders, and I think almost all poor responders in groups 1 and 2. So you can see here our own experience, first cycle done with an antagonist. Say we had a clinical pregnancy rate of 36%. A lot of these patients where we noticed that failure was because of poor quality embryos, which in turn were because of an asynchronous cohort and one follicle becoming dominant, which I saw in almost 20 to 30% of patients in antagonist cycles. Subsequently, in the second cycle, when we used a long agonist protocol, you had a much better response and a significant 44% again getting pregnant in the second cycle after the first cycle failed with an antagonist. So always be proactive. In the first cycle, if you know that, okay, with the antagonist, even in normal responder, she gave you 10 eggs, 12 eggs, 15 eggs, she is unlikely to hyper respond or go into OHSS in the second cycle, and she would be a safe candidate for switching over to the time-tested agonist protocol. This is probably the most important slide that I want to show you today. This was a small study we conducted last year in 36 patients. And it probably is the best control study you can ever have, because all the previous international literature I showed you compared 500 patients of the agonist versus 500 patients with the antagonist. Now those were of course different sets of patients. The 500 in group 1 were not the same patients as 500 in group 2. Here we did the same 36 patients. In the same patient, the first cycle was done with an antagonist, the second cycle was done with an agonist, and these were all potential poor responders, age group varying from 27 to 41, with AMH levels less than 2 nanograms per ml. So these were all potential poor responders. And since we normally follow a policy of embryo accumulation or pooling for these patients, we do not transfer the patient embryos after the first cycle if we don't have at least 3 top quality embryos. Now you can very clearly see here that when you compare the agonist performance to the antagonist performance, the percentage of top quality embryos in the agonist cycles was as high as 30%, almost double of the 17.5% seen with the antagonist cycles. Also, if you see poor quality embryos with antagonist cycles, if it was at 65%, with the agonist cycle, it was down to just about 38%. So this clearly shows that you will have much higher percentage of top quality embryos when you use an agonist in a patient who is a potential poor responder as compared to the antagonist. Of course, we still have to extrapolate this to the pregnancy rates, but obviously, if you get double the number of top quality embryos with an agonist cycle, कौन है? अरे हेलो तेजस.
Hello, sir.
Ah,
Yeah, sir, we can begin now.
no, I'm getting a lot of messages that they can't see or hear anything. A lot of phone calls are coming. Are you sure it's going properly? Because even I can't see myself. Hello?
Yeah, it's live. It's live.
Are you sure?
Yes, sir.
But then why everybody is messaging that they can't see? Anyway, so I'll go on. So this is probably excuse me for the interruption because I got some messages saying that they can't hear or see the presentation properly. So this clearly shows that for groups 1 and 2, Poseidon, the agonist protocol seems to give a much higher proportion of top quality embryos as compared to the antagonist protocol. Okay, so now I got a message that they can hear and see clearly. So I don't know why that confusion was. Anyway, so now let's move on to what should be the dosing strategy in these groups 1 and 2. So we are still talking about Poseidon groups 1 and 2, which is young and old patients with a normal ovarian reserve and an unexpected poor ovarian response. The first reflex that all of us have is to step up the doses. Now here you can see again in this survey, almost 85% of the world clinicians used doses in excess of 300 IU. Now this is something which needs to be set right today itself. How high should you be going with your doses? Please remember, as Tilburg showed in 2017, that increasing the dose of FSH in the second cycle by 50 to 75 IU will help to improve the pregnancy rate. So you don't need to panic and double your doses. If you're at 150, you don't need to go to 450. If you're at 300, you don't need to go to 600 and so on. And you can see here very clearly, if you increase the dose, say from 225 to 300, or 150 to 225, you will have a significantly higher number of oocytes and better live birth rates in these patients. So please remember, there has to be an upper cap at the amount of dosing that you should go to. And as far as most of the available literature shows, there is no justification for going beyond 300 IU in any patient from any Poseidon group whatsoever. To again tell you that does one extra oocyte really matter? And you can see here with each additional oocyte that you get, you can see there is a significant increase in the pregnancy rates. So from 3.8, 8.5, 12.4, with every additional oocyte that you have a significant increase as Bosdag showed in 2017. So it is important to get even that extra 1 or 2 oocyte. What about the use of letrozole in poor responders? It came with a bang. Letrozole became part of a protocol for every patient. But now we have a good study here, and my own personal experience clearly shows that clomiphene citrate seems to do much better as an adjunct to FSH or HMG when you're using the short antagonist protocol in a poor responder. And clomiphene citrate, as this study showed, when compared to letrozole, gave you a much better overall pregnancy and live birth rates per cycle. Let's move on then to the more difficult category, and that is groups 3 and 4. And you can here see these are patients who are young or old. So group 3 is patients who are under 35. Group 4 is patients who are above 35, who to begin with have a poor ovarian reserve. So these are the expected poor responders. You know that this patient is not going to give you adequate oocytes. Of course, we know the various reasons for all this, but please remember that in these women, higher doses of gonadotropins will not compensate for the absence of follicles. So you cannot flog a dead horse to life. The same way, you cannot flog an ovary which just doesn't have the follicles to give you eggs with as high a dose of FSH or HMG you go. And I cannot stress this more and more over and over again, because I still find so many patients being given 450, 600, even 1200 IU a day in the hope that she will give you some extra oocytes. So again, here are the treatment strategies which need to be considered: whether you should use agonist versus the antagonist, whether you should use HMG instead of FSH, what is the role of embryo accumulation and frozen embryo transfers, does PGTA have any role to play, and what do we know about dual stimulation? So let's begin again with my personally favorite subject, and that is agonist versus antagonist. I have always held and preferred the use of the agonist in poor responders. And here you can see a study from 2018, which compared the agonist with the antagonist groups 3 and 4, group 3 Poseidon. And again, clearly you see the live birth rate with the long agonist protocol almost double the pregnancy rate that you get with a short antagonist protocol. And the main reason for this is that you get a synchronous cohort. Even if it is 3 follicles, if all 3 are 18 mm at the same time, you will definitely get a better crop of 2 or 3 top quality embryos as compared to the antagonist, where you have a higher chance of getting follicular dominance and an asynchronous cohort. Again, how high should you go with FSH doses? Classic study way back from 2010, still we always forget our classic studies, comparing 300 versus 450 versus 600, and clearly you can see there is no difference in the live birth rates whether you use 300 or 50 or 600 in Poseidon groups 3 and 4. So no matter how much you increase the dose, your outcome will remain the same. So what should then be the cap? When you know that you don't have follicles and there is no point in going too high with the doses, here we clearly have an indicator that current evidence available to us today does not provide a clear justification for going beyond 150 IU in these poor responders of groups 3 and 4 Poseidon. So please remember now that the latest ESHRE recommendations and most of the supportive literature shows that for groups 3 and 4, where you don't have enough follicles, 150 is enough to support the growth of those few follicles. What about modified natural cycle IVF versus high dose ovarian stimulation? Here again, very important to note that even that one extra oocyte, so if you have a patient on modified natural cycle or on conventional high dose, and in both you get just one oocyte, you can see the pregnancy rates are almost the same at 3.4 to 4%. But if you have more than two oocytes, and here you can see with modified natural cycle you get your one oocyte, but the minute you have more than two oocytes with conventional high dose ovarian stimulation, your pregnancy rates are much higher with conventional ovarian stimulation. So it clearly, the reason for showing this slide is that a lot of us tend to panic. If you don't have, say you have just 2 or 3 follicles, you tend to try and counsel the patient, oh, I don't think it's good enough for IVF. Let's convert this to IUI. There's no point going ahead and spending the money on the IVF procedure. But if you look at this paper very clearly, there is no point in doing this. The minute you have 2 or more follicles, you will have a much higher pregnancy rate with continuance of IVF rather than converting the patient to an IUI. So the only justification for converting to an IUI is if you have a monofollicular cycle. If you have anything more than 2 follicles, please go ahead with the IVF, because there is no guarantee that in the next cycle she is going to give you more oocytes. What I am most excited about, and what I really feel is going to work wonders, or rather be almost like a magical treatment for these categories groups 3 and 4, is the new or the novel dual stimulation protocols. So this of course was published a few years ago, but we didn't give it the due attention that it deserved. And it seems to be very promising, because I have almost completed about 24 patients now with the dual stimulation. We still don't have the pregnancy rates, because we didn't, with all this which happened in the last 1 month, the patients still have to undergo embryo transfers. But what is this dual stimulation about? Now, this exploits basic physiology that every woman doesn't have just one phase of follicular recruitment in the follicular phase. And you can see here 68% of women have two waves of follicular recruitment within the same menstrual cycle, and 32% of women have three waves of follicular recruitment in a menstrual cycle, which means technically you could keep picking up oocytes not just once around the 12th or 13th day of the cycle, but even a second or a third time in the same menstrual cycle. So this was Ubaldi's original publication of 51 patients, all poor responders with poor ovarian reserve, low AMH and low AFC levels, who were undergoing ICSI treatment with PGTA. And basically, to show you how he did it, you begin, he started rec FSH with rec LH, 300 and 150 from day 2 of the cycle, as we normally do in an antagonist protocol. You add the antagonist when the leading follicle is 14 millimeters in mean diameter. When the follicle reaches 18 millimeter in mean diameter, he gave an agonist trigger. Now the trick here is you cannot use HCG. HCG will have a long half-life. You will have a lot of conversion to potent corpora lutea. You will have high levels of progesterone, and this will interfere with your luteal phase stimulation. So you have to give just the agonist trigger, do your egg retrieval at the usual 36 hours, wait for 3 or 4 days, again begin stimulation with REC-FSH, REC-LH combination, or just REC-FSH or HMG or whatever your preference is, and again go through the same thing, again with the antagonist, again a GnRH agonist trigger, and again a second retrieval procedure, which might even be during her menstruation. In fact, of the patients, 20 odd patients that I've done, almost 14 or 15 of them, at the time of the luteal phase pickup, she was already menstruating. So just ignore that. You will still see good follicular growth. You will have good number of oocytes and probably better embryos too. Now you will say, what is the logic of doing a dual stimulation? Why can't you just wait? What about the corpora lutea? How will you differentiate a new follicle from an old corpus luteum and so on? The advantage was, as shown in this paper here, that the rate of patients obtaining at least one euploid blastocyst increased from 42% with follicular phase stimulation to 65% with the contribution of luteal phase stimulation. So it is not just about getting eggs again in the second half of the menstrual cycle, but getting better quality oocytes and better quality embryos. And I have noticed this in almost 70 to 80% of the patients where I have done a dual stimulation after 2 or 3 failed stimulation cycles, patients who just want their own baby and are not ready to even listen to the word egg donor. So this is the category where it is definitely worth trying. Of course, it's premature days. I still don't have data of all those 20 patients going through their embryo transfers and the pregnancy rates, but the gut feeling is that you definitely get more oocytes, you get more metaphase 2 oocytes, you get more top quality embryos in luteal phase stimulation in almost 80% of these poor responders. So this is one area which needs active research. It's very easy to do. There are no side effects. With good counseling, I'm sure all of you should be able to begin doing dual stimulation and have your own experience to share with me maybe after a year's time. So here you can see statistically significantly better embryos with luteal phase stimulation. Before dual stimulation came in, what I personally used to really like doing for poor responders is not to do an embryo transfer if you don't have a good quality embryo. So we used to counsel them that it's best to do embryo pooling or embryo accumulation, because the worst thing that really shatters a patient in IVF, I'm sure all of you will agree, is to get a negative test result. If you tell them you got less eggs, they feel bad for maybe a day. If you tell them you have not very good embryos, they maybe feel bad for 3 days. But if you tell her, sorry, your pregnancy test has failed, you set some of them back by 3 months or even a year. So please try to minimize that. If you know that this embryo is not going to implant, please don't transfer it. Just put it in the freezer. Try a second round of stimulation with a different protocol and try to get better quality embryos before you do a good frozen transfer for the patient. So all these 48 patients were potential poor responders with low AMH. 2 to 3 cycles of stimulation. First would be an agonist, second would be an antagonist, or vice versa, or a clomiphene cycle. And we did this until we have at least 3 top quality embryos in the freezer. Initially, we used to use a combination of REC-FSH and REC-LH. Pregnancy rates were not bad at 22%, which is very good for these patients who otherwise have very low pregnancy rates of less than 10% with fresh embryo transfers. Subsequently, we switched to the use of HPHMG, that is highly purified HMG, where you have HCG-driven LH activity and not just normal LH. And we found a significant increase in the pregnancy rate from 22% to as high as about 35%. Of course, this was our preliminary study. Since then, we have been routinely doing this as an approach till dual stimulation began, with excellent results of 30 to 35% after two stimulation cycles using the agonist or the antagonist protocol. A recent study which corroborated these findings, 2019, where this study group, accumulation of embryos over three, of course, they did natural modified IVF cycles followed by embryo transfer. And again, you can see the live birth rate at around 30% as against 13% in the control group, where you just do a fresh embryo transfer. What about LH supplementation? Another very important area, because this particularly holds a lot of promise for patients who are poor responders. What do we know now and what is consensus? All elderly women, LH does help them, but has to be given from day one of stimulation. Hyporesponders who go on with a very long follicular phase, the follicles become stagnant. You can add it on day 6 or day 7 because you already started stimulation. But if you know from a previous cycle that she is a hyporesponder, it's best to start LH from the day 1 of stimulation. Poor responders, a lot of initial studies by Kolibianakis and a lot of other researchers showed that addition of REC-LH did not improve the outcome in poor responders. The same group subsequently have shown that you will get significantly higher number of oocytes, because even one or two additional oocytes will improve your take-home baby rates in a lot of poor responders. So again, to highlight that just giving normal LH may not be enough. Of course, this is a highly controversial area, and every major conference we have, there's always controversy as to whether LH is better or HCG driven LH activity is better. Just to put a few points in place here, we know that the half-life of HCG is 6 to 8 times longer than that of LH. And as a result, if you give HCG in small quantities daily from day 2 of the cycle, it tends to accumulate and give you a better benefit as compared to using normal LH, which gets washed out or cleared out in a matter of a few hours. And there is no cumulative effect of normal LH. So as you can show, this study showed that the higher the cumulated HCG level on day 6 of the cycle, the higher was the proportion of top quality embryos that you get. And again, you can see here that when you see LH on day 6, there is no change in live birth rate because there is no accumulation of LH. But when you use HCG driven LH activity, as HCG accumulates, the higher the HCG level on day 6 of cycle, the higher is your live birth rate in that patient. So personally, we prefer to use HCG driven LH activity. Of course, we are waiting for Pergoveris or other similar drugs where we will have a combination of FSH and LH in a ratio of 2:1 and see how that performs in comparison to HCG driven LH activity. Very controversial area, no international consensus as of now, is whether we should be using adjuncts. What we do know is that with increasing age, there is a reduction in testosterone levels in most women, and that androgen supplementation in some form might help to improve the response in poor responders. DHEA came with a bang. We found initial publications showing increase in the AMH levels, lower rates of aneuploidy and miscarriages. But subsequently, we had 3 large randomized controls trials which do not demonstrate any significant benefit with the use of DHEA. What about testosterone? Most of the initial research papers have shown giving just for about 15 to 20 days pre-stimulation. Now we know this may not be ideal, may not be adequate, because if you look at basic physiology, the action of testosterone needs to begin at least 60 days prior to the follicular recruitment and the stimulation cycle. So we now, of course, have in process since 2017 the T-Transport trial. And of course, we've had a lot of publications before that showing benefits. And you can see here a meta-analysis of RCTs in 2019 by Noventa's group showed better live birth rates, more oocytes, higher number of metaphase oocytes, and higher number of embryos with the use of testosterone pretreatment. We are all awaiting the results of the T-Transport trial, where testosterone is being administered for 60 days before the stimulation. You can see here testosterone gel is used for 60 days. And the control group took placebo gel. This was followed by the downregulation long protocol and the use of HPHMG 300 IU in both arms of the study. So it will be very interesting to see whether the 21 days was sufficient or whether we really need to give testosterone for 60 days, just as we were taught to give DHEA for 3 months before starting stimulation cycle. So what I have been doing until now, of course, we don't know whether it really helps. Testosterone, the gel which is available to us commercially, for 20 days pre-stimulation. So you begin from day 6 of the preceding cycle until day 2 of the stimulation cycle. So you roughly get about 20 days of testosterone before you begin FSH. What about growth hormone? This was a large study, and there are a lot of studies since then. Of course, it's very expensive. We still don't have enough data. The numbers of the patients in all the studies are not adequate. And Norman in 2019 showed that 130 patients, there was no difference, significant difference in live birth rates with the use of growth hormone as against not using growth hormone. What about coenzyme Q? So here we have a paper which shows that coenzyme Q might help, and especially Poseidon groups 3, where 60 days of CoQ treatment was done in these patients, and they found significantly lower gonadotropin requirements, lower cancellation rates, higher number of oocytes and embryos, and probably a higher pregnancy rate with the use of coenzyme Q as pre-treatment. Another very important area, which may not be a classical poor responder, but like I told you, this also is an abnormal response, that you had 20 follicles, but you got only 10 oocytes. So this again now shows that maybe we should not be using only an HCG trigger, and maybe it's time to use a dual trigger. That means a combination of HCG 6500 recombinant along with zero point 0.2 milligrams of triptorelin as a dual trigger for patients, especially for poor responders, because you have less follicles. You have only 4 follicles. You don't want to get only 2 oocytes. You want all 4 oocytes. It would be best to give a dual trigger. And you can see here, when you use a dual trigger, you have significantly higher number of oocytes, higher number of top quality embryos, higher number of oocytes retrieved, and higher pregnancy rates with the use of the double trigger. Also, many a times you get your 10 oocytes, but only 3 metaphase 2, only 2 metaphase 2 when your ICSI specialist denudes the oocytes. Again, a dual trigger might help to reduce this and give you a much higher conversion rate and much higher number of metaphase 2 oocytes. You can see here from 3 to 6.5 with the use of the double trigger as compared to the use of conventional HCG alone. What about specifically poor responders? And here we have a paper from 2019 comparing all three, that is just HCG at 36 hours pre-oocyte retrieval, the agonist 36 hours before retrieval, and HCG add back on the day of egg retrieval, and agonist and HCG at 40 and 34 hours prior to egg retrieval respectively, that is the dual trigger. And clearly he showed that patients in the dual trigger group had a significantly higher number of top quality embryos as compared to only the HCG or only the agonist trigger groups. Again, here you can see with the use of the dual trigger, the study group, fertilization rates much higher than use of HCG alone, live birth rates at 26.9 as against 14.5, and so on. So maybe in women, especially with diminished ovarian reserve, the dual trigger should be the norm to help you get all the 4 or all the 3 oocytes that you have, to also ensure that all 3 are metaphase 2s, and to also try and get as many top quality embryos as you can get from these difficult group of patients. So my personal protocol, I like to give coenzyme Q and resveratrol 40 milligrams for a period of 2 to 3 months pre-stimulation. Testosterone gel 20 days pre-stimulation as of now, but once the results of the T-transport trial are out, maybe 60 days would be ideal, we don't know. A first choice protocol is the long agonist protocol with HPHMG using HCG driven LH activity 300 IU per day. If that doesn't for some reason give me a good number of eggs or embryos, then a second choice treatment would be antagonist pre-treatment days 2, 3, and 4, or estradiol pre-treatment from day 25. Use of clomiphene 100 milligrams from day 2 right until day 10. Then use a combination of REC, FSH, and HPHMG in a 1:1 ratio with the antagonist as usual, and a dual trigger. Duostim, done more than 20 patients, but if the pregnancy rates are fascinating and really good, it might soon be first choice protocol at our center. Fresh embryo transfer if progesterone is between 0.5 and 1.5 on the day of HCG, and you have your 2 top quality embryos in the available in the fresh cycle. Anything else, anything less than that, you do a frozen embryo transfer with embryo accumulation. So this is currently what we follow at our clinic for all group Poseidon stages, groups 3 and 4 patients. What about the laboratory aspects? We always often hear that maybe hatching should be done for all these women, or ICSI should be done because you have only 3 eggs, you don't want to take a chance, and maybe ICSI is better. So let's straighten the news here. You can see in this recent study that the chance of live birth was in fact reduced in the assisted hatching group. So of course, there are arguments to and against for both the groups, but it's your personal choice. But probably there is not much of benefit by doing assisted hatching in Poseidon groups 3 and 4 or in elderly patients unless you have a clearly documented thick zona pellucida and your embryologist says that yes, doctor, we need to hatch this embryo. What about ICSI for all? Now, this is something I feel very strongly about because 95% of Indian clinics, for reasons best known to them, do ICSI for all patients. Means every patient who steps into the clinic undergoes ICSI despite evidence to the contrary. If you see the number of papers and publications that we have, that ICSI does not offer any advantage over IVF, no benefit of ICSI over IVF. There is a very low incidence of failed fertilization, not justifying ICSI for all. ICSI results in fewer live births. IVF versus ICSI, IVF is better than ICSI in all aspects as recently as 2019 and so on. There is no evidence that ICSI is of benefit in poor responders or in elderly women. So please go back and change this practice. You don't need to do ICSI for all poor responders. We know that ICSI has its own problems. It's time consuming. There will be temperature pH fluctuations. You require a skilled embryologist. Cost will go up. And where is the indication? In IVF, it's so easy to do. And you can see here in Europe, 65% of cycles are ICSI. In US, it's 76. India, of course, we don't have official figures, but from whatever I talk to people at conferences, most of them do ICSI for all. So we need to rethink this. IVF is really easy to do, and I don't see the justification for doing ICSI for all patients, especially of poor responders. What about PGTA? Again, strongly recommended by a lot of clinics that, oh, poor responder, elderly patient, you must do PGTA. Yes, it will help not to improve the live birth rate, but it will reduce or eliminate your miscarriages because the biggest advantage of PGTA will be that you will pick up the aneuploidic embryos, not transfer them, and therefore not end up with early miscarriages. But it will not increase the live birth rate in the elderly age group between 36 and 40. In the Indian context, we also have to consider the cost to the patient, which is in thousands of rupees per embryo tested, higher workload for the IVF lab, and so on. What about PRP ovarian activation? We have a lot of papers coming up. A lot of centers have started doing injection of autologous PRP into the ovarian stroma with the hope that this will help to rejuvenate some ovarian tissue. Early days, still very premature to say whether it really helps or not. This is one paper that I could find, and where they said that, of course, although the treatment of poor ovarian responders is a great therapeutical challenge, the use of intra-ovarian injection of autologous PRP before IVF sounds a bit promising and might get a glimmer of new hope for improving IVF success rates in this batch of patients. Of course, we still need more publications, more research on this before we can routinely advocate it to all our patients. And finally, when all fails, your agonist, antagonist, testosterone, DHEA, growth hormones, coenzyme Q, resveratrol, embryo accumulation, dual stimulation, highly purified HMG, if everything still doesn't give you a live birth, finally you don't have any choice but to resort to oocyte donation. Extremely successful for Poseidon groups 1, 2, 3, 4, all of them. If the endometrium receptivity is ideal, you can straight away expect pregnancy rates in the range of 50 to 60%. And as you can see my own data here, consistently month after month, pregnancy rates are usually in the range of 50, 60, and some months even 70% with the use of oocyte donation. So to conclude then, of course, we need to understand that don't give up the long agonist protocol. Both agonist and antagonist are equally recommended for poor responders, Poseidon's group 1 and 2, as also for groups 3 and 4. Clomiphene in combination with gonadotropin is recommended. Addition of letrozole is no longer recommended in poor responders as per the ASHRAE guidelines. For groups 1 and 2, you can step up to as high as 300, but no need to go beyond that. 150 can become 225 or 300 max for these patients. For groups 3 and 4, 150 is the cap and 300 is not recommended because they don't have the follicles to stimulate. So what is the point in going up with your doses? Modified natural cycle and mild stimulation are not recommended. Adjuvant growth hormone, DHEA, aspirin as of today not recommended for low responders. Addition of REC-LH to REC-FSH might increase the number of oocytes and improve cycle outcome. HP-HMG is equally effective as REC-LH. Now, here the important point that luteal phase stimulation, dual stimulation, as per the ASHRAE guidelines, is only recommended for cancer patients where time is of the essence. But they clearly say that the benefits of luteal phase stimulation need more studies. And as a take home message, I would recommend that all of you take up dual stimulation seriously. And I'm sure and I feel that there will be a good light at the end of the tunnel for our groups 3 and 4. So, thank you very much. All of you have been a very, very good audience. And of course, I'd love to take the question and answer session. I think Tejas can get back to me.
Yes, sir, we can go for the question and answers. I'll just okay. So the first question is from Dr. Asha.
Yeah.
She's from Bangalore.
Yeah.
Uh, she's thanking you at first, sir. Happy afternoon. Why is there a widespread fall of fertility in our country, which is evident in our falling AMH and falling AFC in all population strata? How do we stop this catastrophe?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's a very good question. Thank you, Dr. Asha, for that. And it's really surprising, but there is a very good study where they compared, I think, 180 Spanish women with 180 Indian women, and they found that Indian women had an earlier decline in AMH and AFC as by as much as 6 years earlier. So this is definitely a warning sign. Now we didn't know whether this is racial, whether this is constitutional, genetic, nutritional, environmental. We don't know the reasons. So for that, there was another study done comparing Indian women who were born and brought up in the United States versus white American women. So this would give them the same environment, same upbringing, same everything, except the genetic constitution. And again, they found that the Indian fertility was a bit lower than white American women. So of course, there is a problem. We need to understand and appreciate this. The other big problem is what a recent survey of 7 cities in India showed, that in the age group of 30 to 40, which is the commonest age group, I'm sure you'll agree, must be the same in Bangalore, coming to us today, the incidence of infertility is 46%. So we need to understand and appreciate that Indian women fertility may be lower than the West. There is an earlier decline. We know that 88% of oocytes are depleted by the age of 30. And so probably we need to recommend a lot of social egg freezing, especially in the light of our women, especially daughters and daughters-in-law opting for higher education, better careers, and so on. So social egg freezing should be more and more popular to help these women have their own biological offspring. As far as other reasons are concerned, we really can't pinpoint as to what is causing this. I believe that it was always there, but now because women are delaying their childbearing, they are losing that AMH at say 32, 34, 35, when they should have had the kids maybe before 30, and that is why we are seeing more and more of this problem. Of course, we need a lot of huge surveys and studies to find out and pinpoint the etiological factors for this particular problem.
Okay,
Yeah,
sir.
Tejas.
So the next question is from Ms. Dipshika. She's from Mumbai. Are there increased risk of early menopausal transition and natural menopause after poor response at first IVF treatment?
You are not inducing an early menopause by doing an IVF because you cannot recruit follicles from the entire ovary. Every month, as we know, the recruitment process begins, say, about 2 to 3 months earlier. So the number of oocytes or follicles which are say to be recruited in June is obviously already pre-decided by nature, maybe in April or May. So when you do a stimulation, you can only recruit that many follicles. So whatever follicles have already been recruited, but in nature, what happens that the endogenous FSH is just enough to support the growth of one follicle, whereas the other two or three which were recruited would undergo atresia. So she would anyway, every normal woman would lose a lot of follicles every month, although just one becomes dominant and ovulates. When we do aggressive ovarian stimulation, we just ensure that the entire cohort grows and we are not taking from her store. So I don't think I exactly got the question correctly, but I think you are implying that will this induce premature menopause? No, the answer is it won't, because you cannot take from her remaining reserve. You are only stimulating the cohort which was recruited for that particular month by nature, pre-decided 2 to 3 months ago.
Okay, so that was good. The next question is from Mr. John. He is from Ahmedabad. Can you explain about the ovarian reserve in poor responders and how can it help in managing it?
What exact aspect? Because that was the entire lecture was all about that. So of course, basically if you have a low ovarian reserve, you would have tested it with age, AMH, and AFC, and then as I showed you in my lecture, you would then proceed depending on whether she falls in Poseidon group 3 or 4, 1 or 2. You would have various approaches. But it's not that you can't do ovulation induction or IUI for these patients. If it's a young couple, even if she comes with an AMH of say 1.2 or 1, you feel it's low, a couple of months of good stimulated IUI could also work before you move in for more aggressive IVF with your embryo accumulations and dual stimulation protocols.
Okay, so the next question is from uh, the name is okay. I'll just read the question.
Yeah.
ESPAT trial showed that addition of LH did not show any benefit in Bologna poor responders.
Yeah.
Your thoughts? What is your dose of uh, REC-FSH menopause in your Poseidon 3/4 cases?
Yeah, so in Poseidon 3 and 4, if I'm using the long agonist protocol, if she's a normal BMI patient, as I told you, just 150 IU of HPHMG is enough. If you feel she has a high BMI, you could go maximally to a dose of say 225 or at best 300 IU, but usually 300 is not required. So with the long agonist, maybe 150 to 225 IU. With the short antagonist, again, just 150 IU of HPHMG is enough. Personally, I would like to begin REC LH from the beginning. So you can use, say, 150 or 225 of REC FSH with 75 or better 150 IU of REC LH in Poseidons 3 and 4. Or you could directly start with 150 to 225 of highly purified HMG with HCG driven LH activity. So these would be the two choices for these two groups as far as gonadotropins and doses are concerned.
Okay, so the next question is, can you explain about GNSAF bioactivity of the women who may be poor responder?
GN?
GNSAF.
GNSAF. There's some spelling problem.
All right, then we'll just jump to the next question. So the next question is from Miss Monica Ravuri from Vizag.
Yeah.
How to give dual trigger? What are the drugs given?
Yeah, so dual trigger is a combination of HCG. If 10,000 if you're using urinary HCG, 6,500 if you're using recombinant HCG, and along with that you give zero point 0.2 milligrams of triptorelin acetate. So triptorelin you get preloaded syringes of 0.1 milligram. So we like to give two syringes, that is zero point 0.2 milligram along with that. Now most of the time we end up giving both at 36 hours. But as I showed you that one paper, the ideal would be to give the triptorelin at 40 hours and the HCG at 34 hours prior to the oocyte retrieval. So that should be your protocol for the dual trigger.
The next question is from Miss Momita Naha. She's from Kolkata. Do you support dual trigger for all poor responders?
Yeah, we give dual trigger for all patients, whether they are normal or poor responders. Only in the high responders, obviously, you cannot give HCG. So anybody with more than 15 follicles, you would use only the agonist trigger and probably do a freeze-all because fresh pregnancy rates would not be very good. But for all poor responders, a dual trigger is ideal because, as I told you earlier, and I repeat, you want maximum from those 3 or 4 or 5 follicles. So if your trigger is not adequate and you end up getting just 2 out of the 5 follicles as metaphase 2 oocytes, it's not an ideal outcome. So it's best to give a dual trigger so that at least you try and maximize and optimize that you get all 5 mature oocytes and maybe 2 or 3 top quality embryos at the outset. And when you spend so much on the gonadotropins, there is no real additional cost in adding zero point 0.2 milligrams of triptorelin. So it's definitely worth your while to use a dual trigger for all poor responders and even all normal responders who have less than 15 follicles and are not at risk of ovarian hyperstimulation.
Okay, so the next question is from Miss Sonali Tavade. She's from Mulund, Mumbai. What's the brand name of Resveratrol?
Resveratrol, you get only resveratrol from various companies. That is online from GNC and all the supplement stores. There is one company now which gives you a combination of coenzyme Q with resveratrol, 40 milligrams, which I think is known as UBQHR. So that seems to work pretty well because it gives you both coenzyme ubiquinol as well as resveratrol in the right proportion.
So the next question is from Mr. Ramesh. He's from Kochi. Mild stimulation and MNC is not recommended in POR. At the same time, CC alone or in combination with gonadotropin is recommended. How to account for this?
No, so that normally what we do is we combine it with the gonadotropin. So clomiphene citrate, they have not said totally not to be done. They are just saying the available statistics do not show better pregnancy rates by doing just a mild or a modified natural cycle. So if you wish for cost reasons or whatever, you could do a clomiphene cycle alone. But ideally, it should be combined with gonadotropins to get your optimal response.
The next question is from Mr. Pandit Annarao Falaskar. He's from Aurangabad. What is your luteal phase support in poor responders?
The luteal phase support now, if you're doing a fresh cycle, we normally give either 8% vaginal gel once a day, or as you know, as per the Lotus trial now, just dydrogesterone is enough. So you can give dydrogesterone 30 milligrams a day, that is 10 milligrams TID. So any patient where you're doing a fresh embryo transfer, where you have a functioning corpus luteum, you can either use 8% vaginal gel, or you can use dydrogesterone 10 milligrams TID, or you can use micronized vaginal progesterone in capsule form, maybe 200 milligrams BID or TID. But since majority of IVF clinics now prefer to do frozen embryo transfers, and in recipient cycles, especially if you're doing embryo accumulation and pooling, or if you're doing dual stimulation where you have to freeze all the embryos, you cannot do a fresh transfer because it's a luteal phase stimulation. In these patients, when you do an artificial preparation with estrogen and progesterone, the progesterone requirement is higher because there is no corpus luteum in that particular cycle. So there we prefer to give 8% vaginal gel twice a day, or you can give 800 milligrams of micronized vaginal progesterone in capsule form, or you can give intramuscular injection of 100 milligrams in oil if the patient can tolerate the pain and the other side effects. The dydrogesterone dose is still under study because the new Lotus trials are now ongoing to find out that just like we know that 30 is sufficient in fresh transfer, we need to fine tune the dose of whether 40 is sufficient for frozen embryo transfers. So in the recipient cycles, we are still not sure of whether dydrogesterone alone works or not, whether it has to be supplemented with MVP, and if dydrogesterone alone is enough, then what is the ideal dose? Is it 40 or is it even higher? These studies are still underway.
So the next question is from Dr. Sohini Munshi from Kolkata. Can dual trigger be given against long agonist protocol for group 1 and 2?
You cannot use a dual trigger in an agonist cycle because you totally cut off the endogenous FSH and LH. As you know, that is the basic physiology of the long agonist protocol. There is no FSH LH left to be released. So you cannot give an agonist trigger when you already done an agonist down regulation and suppression. So it's only HCG trigger there. There's no other option in down regulation cycles. But for antagonist cycles, you can use dual trigger.
So the next question is from Mr. Vivek. He's from Chennai. Is there any role of OFFA, ovarian fragmentation and follicular activation?
No, that's what I told you. I just showed you that one paper which I could find on PubMed, one publication where they show that ovarian activation with PRP, autologous PRP, might work. I also have a couple of patients now who are doing a different form of ovarian activation where the ovarian biopsy is taken, it's in vitro activated and then reimplanted back into the body. I have one patient from Tokyo and one from Canada. But despite having done the procedures twice, still when I stimulate them, they have absolutely zero follicular response. Their AMH is zero, FSH is 30 or 40. So I'm not really convinced about the utility of these procedures. But then, like with everything new, we have to wait. We have to wait for more trials, more RCTs to be published. But as of now, I know there are one or two clinicians in India who are doing intra-ovarian PRP, maybe more now. And it would be interesting to know what the results are. Personally, I have not used it too much, but I showed you that one paper which I found where it seems that it may give you a better response after intra-ovarian activation.
So the next question is from Yashodhara Mhatre. She's from Mumbai. Can you use estradiol down regulation from day 25 in an agonist cycle in poor responders with low AMH?
In agonist cycles, you can't use it because the whole purpose is not there. In agonist cycles, it would be best to give her one progesterone shot on day 21 to cover both ovulatory and ovulatory patients to ensure a good endometrial shedding, and then begin your agonist because anyway you are programming with the agonist. So you don't need a double programming. And in agonist, once you have completely down regulated her, you will always get a uniform or a synchronous cohort. So there is no point in giving her the estrogen. In antagonist cycles, we are giving estrogen because if we don't, and suppose you delay stimulation, instead of day 2 you begin on day 3, the follicular recruitment and dominance procedure may already have started, and that is what you want to prevent with the use of that exogenous estrogen. So in agonist cycles, you don't need to give any either OC pills or even estrogen or even norethistérone. You can let her get her menstruation at the appropriate time, then you can start FSH whenever you wish to, which is the whole beauty and advantage of using the agonist cycle for batch IVF. But in short cycles, which the majority of people are now practicing, OC pills are not recommended. Best is to use luteal estradiol or norethistérone, or what I have just started using is just give antagonist on day 2, 3, and 4. because in centers such as ours, which are almost a 365-day program, just occasionally for that conference which comes on a weekend, all we need is to push it by 2 or 3 days, which is very easy to do with the antagonist. So you don't need to wait for a month, or again call around day 20 and day 25 and so on. Monday, you just give an antagonist on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and start stimulation from Thursday. So that's how it works. But in agonist cycles, you cannot use luteal estradiol.
Okay, so the next question is from Dr. Aditi. She is from Mumbai. Sir, have you used progesterone supplemented protocols on your patient instead of agonist or antagonist?
I don't know exactly what that means, progesterone supplemented protocols. Instead of agonist or antagonist, now this is a very new concept. And I think Dr. Christoph Blockil mentioned something about this yesterday, but I'm not very aware. So sorry, I can't answer this question right
Okay, so the next question is from Mr. Ramesh. He's from Kochi. What is the role of single shot? What is the role of single shot of agonist in LPS in cases of agonist protocol where the HPO axis is already suppressed?
No, so actually in agonist cycles, I don't know how much it really works, because it's best to give exogenous progesterone in agonist cycles. But there is, I think, a publication where they have used it, because it's like you correctly said, if it's already suppressed, there is no real logic in reactivating a corpus luteum when there's no endogenous LH left to be released. So I don't see the whole physiology of this particular recommendation. But I agree with you that I've read about it somewhere, but I'm not sure how it works and whether it really works.
Okay, so the next question is from Thinkarna Malapan. What is your choice of agonist dose and timing of start in your long agonist cycles? Doesn't the agonist cause a profound downregulation in DOR cases?
Yeah, that was exactly the point which I was trying to make, that is what we thought, that there will be an over suppression of an already suppressed axis. But the trick here is not to begin then stimulation with FSH alone. So if you noticed, I clearly mentioned that when you use the long agonist protocol, you have to begin stimulation with HMG. Either you can begin rec FSH and rec LH in a combination of say 225 plus 150 each, or you give HP HMG 225 or 300 IU to begin with. So it's very important that you use LH right from the beginning. Coming to the dose of the agonist, normally what we do is we start with zero point 0.5 ml of buserelin or leuprolide acetate, which is started from day 21, that is the mid luteal phase of the previous cycle. You then continue that dose till she gets her menstruation, until you are ready to start your FSH or HMG, depending on how many days you want to program if you're doing your batch IVF. Around day 3 or day 4, we don't like to do too many hormone estimations, but if you're a beginner, you could satisfy yourself and make sure that she has the rule of fives. That is, once she comes on day 4 or day 5, there is no endometrium, it's completely shed, the thickness is less than 5 millimeters, the estradiol is less than 50, progesterone is less than zero point 0.5, FSH is less than 5, LH is less than 5. So if you have the rule of 5 satisfied, it means she is down regulated. You can then begin your FSH or HMG stimulation, and when you do that, we reduce from zero point 0.5 to zero point 0.3 ml, which then continues until the day of HCG. So whether you use buserelin or leuprolide acetate, the dosing is more or less the same with both the preparations. I
Okay,
think
so
I
the
got
next,
one panel question here on me. It's coming
yeah,
in young patient with good AMH. That's the one.
yes, sir.
Yeah. So this is what I was telling you, that she says that in young patient with good AMH, 10 eggs taken out, but only one M2 with ovitrial trigger and 4 follicles, 20 more than 20, 4 more than 18, and 2 more than 16. Now, this is the whole point of giving the dual trigger here, because this is the type of patient which I showed you in that study, that the minute you give a dual trigger, you will have a much higher conversion to metaphase 2s than as compared to the use of HCG alone. Of course, the cohort seems to be pretty synchronous from the question, but still this has happened, and that means that it would be ideal to give her a dual trigger. And now there are a lot of papers showing the superiority of the dual trigger over using HCG alone, not only for poor responders, but also for normal responders.
Okay, so the next question is from Mr. Anita. She is from Guntur. Does pre-treatment with agonist suppress the follicles?
Pre-treatment with agonist. No, that
Does
gives you suppression of the entire hypothalamo-pituitary ovarian axis. And that is the whole idea of down regulation, that you have cut off endogenous FSH-LH totally. You have not suppressed follicles, but you have suppressed the stimulation part, and the FSH-LH, all that is completely suppressed. So only when you then start exogenous addition of FSH or HMG will the follicles start getting recruited and start growing. So you cannot remove follicles by doing a down regulation. You are only suppressing the axis. so that you have flexibility of when you want to start stimulation, and you also ensure that your entire cohort is uniform and one has not escaped and gone ahead and become dominant. Yeah, so heard in one conference that norethistérone having higher progesterone than progesterone in the OC pill will be no. Now, see, in the OC pill, the problem is the estrogen component. The estrogen component, which is high dose, more than 30 or 50 micrograms, is the one which causes the over suppression and all the problems that I initially enumerated. So, the progesterone, when you use norethistérone just 5 milligrams twice a day, it is a very low dose, and it is not going to have the same bad effects that OC pills will have when you subsequently stimulate.
Okay, that's all, sir.
Okay.
You can give a takeaway message then.
Yeah, so the takeaway message is, of course, like I told you, that poor responders are becoming more and more common. We know that the most modern educated women are not going to easily accept egg donation. Prevention is better than cure, so social egg freezing should be promoted and recommended in a big way. Of course, we still don't know how successful egg freezing is going to be. Time will tell once the patients come back and start using their oocytes. But we need to be aware of this, because not all patients are open to the suggestion of egg donation, and this is one area which is really increasing. And the reason I selected this topic is because I find in my practice almost 40% of patients are poor responders to begin with. Means they come with low AMH, low AFC, and I'm sure most doctors in most of the cities are facing the same problem. So, in maybe some categories of patients, it's easy to push the egg donation, but in most, it is not. So, we need to take up this problem very seriously. We need to rethink about whether we should be using antagonist for all, because there is a lot of available data in my own experience that the agonist is doing much better in terms of number of oocytes, number of top quality embryos, and like I showed you, even getting one or two more oocytes will definitely increase the live birth rate for that poor responder. Dual stimulation needs to be seriously explored and researched. I think there is a lot of promise there, and my whole staff is very upbeat, because they've seen the kind of almost miraculous performances in the luteal phase compared to how they used to behave in the past with the conventional protocols and the follicular phase stimulation. Embryo pooling and accumulation also very successful. We are still not sure of the use of adjuvants. Personally, I feel coenzyme Q, resveratrol, and a little bit of testosterone may be helping, but of course, we don't have any hardcore RCTs to prove this point. And of course, finally, there is oocyte donation when everything fails. So I think that should be, and capping the FSH doses. So for groups 1 and 2, don't go beyond 300. For groups 3 and 4, don't go beyond 150. LH supplementation will help a lot of elderly women and poor responders. Whether native LH is enough or we need to use HCG driven LH activity, again, this is a matter of debate. Every ASHRAE or ASRM has huge symposiums debating the two molecules. So, but these are all points to be pondered upon, to be taken very seriously, because we are all going to have more and more patients in this category, especially with late marriage, delayed childbearing, and all the reasons I've told you earlier. So thank you very much, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed been a pleasure talking to all of you today, and I hope that ISAR has more and more such webinars for us. Of course, last but not the least, I have to thank Zydus for supporting this educational initiative for all of us in these difficult times, to be connected and stay connected all over the country. And of course, Doc Mode and especially Tejas for setting up this entire platform and for making it so flawless, so that all of us could have a really good and a good academic session here today. So thank you once again, Isar, and thank you, Doc Mode, and thank you, Zydus. Thank you.
Yeah, sir. There's one more question from Mr. Parashit Tang. Initially, he's thanking you for the informative talk. He's asking, does COC treatment as programming reduce egg yield in low responders?
OCPL treatment? Sorry?
Does COC treatment as
Yeah.
programming reduce
Yeah.
egg yield in low responders?
Yes, it does. It does respond the yield, and more than that, it also increases the chance of a suboptimal response the higher the degree of LH suppression. So in low responders, especially, we should not be using OC pills, because you will have a very prolonged follicular phase of stimulation. You will have excessive consumption of gonadotropins, and you are likely to have not as good a pregnancy rate as you would have without the use of OC pills. And when you have so many three other alternate forms of simple methods like norethistérone, estradiol, and antagonist for programming, why do we need to oversuppress with the use of COCs?
Okay, sir. That's all. That's all with the questions.
So thank you. Thank you.